A golden dream in America's sleep. I still remember the sound of wagon wheels on dry dirt, slow, steady creaking under the weight of hope. You could see them from a distance, lines of people heading west, not saying much, just staring toward the horizon, like it owed them something. My grandfather once told me that folks used to believe the West held answers. Not specific answers, just something better. I never quite understood it as a boy. Why would someone leave everything behind for a place with no roads, no towns, just dust and a promise? But years later, flipping through an old book, I saw it again, that glint of something bright in a shallow stream, and the way it set the whole country moving. Maybe we were not awake when we did it. Maybe we were chasing a dream we had not even dreamed yet. If you are still awake, I will tell you that story. About a time when America packed its bags, pointed its chin toward the unknown, and followed the shimmer of gold into the wilderness. The first paths, west. Long before anyone whispered the word California like a promise, the idea of going west was already stitched into the American imagination. You could feel it in the quiet conversations over dinner, in the faded maps pinned to cabin walls, and in the way men looked toward the sunset as if it were pulling at something inside them. It started slowly, as most big things do. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase handed America a stretch of land, so vast even Thomas Jefferson was not sure what he had just bought. But what it gave the country was not just acres, it gave it direction. East was the past. West was possibility. At first, it was not settlers who went. It was the fur traders, the mountain men. They lived like ghosts between rivers and ridgelines, sometimes not seeing another human for months. Men like Jedediah Smith, who traced unknown trails with nothing but a Bible and a rifle. Or Hugh Glass, who was mauled by a bear and crawled for miles with a broken leg just to survive. These were not heroes in any polished sense. They were wild men in a wild place, and they left footprints that others would one day follow. The idea of manifest destiny had not yet been named, but it was already breathing. People began to believe quietly at first that the country was meant to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that maybe, just maybe, it was their duty to fill that space with farms, families, and flags. By the 1830s, wagon trails began to form, not official roads, just ruts in the grass, made by desperate wheels. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail. They were not paved with gold, but with broken axles, lost shoes, and markers where children had died. People still went. Some walked the entire way barefoot with everything they owned in a cart no bigger than a bathtub. You might remember hearing about the Donner Party in school, a group of families trying to take a shortcut to California. Snowed in, starved, and then, worse. Their story was not an outlier. It was just the most famous. Thousands of others struggled westward, driven by hope strong enough to overlook the cost. The West did not welcome them. It was not waiting with open arms. It was jagged and dry and quiet in the most menacing way. Rattlesnakes, sudden storms, dust that got into your teeth and never left. But there was still something there. A pull, a shimmer, a promise no one could fully explain, only chase. You might think the government organized it all, mapped it out carefully. But the truth is, much of it was guesswork. The maps were wrong, the rivers ran dry, and towns appeared on paper before they ever appeared in real life. Still, the movement continued. There was a kind of madness to it, a soft-spoken, determined madness. Imagine waking up before the sun, hitching oxen to a wooden frame, and walking beside it for 5 months. Just walking. through mud over mountains, across rivers while your children cried and your food spoiled. And doing all of that not because you knew what waited ahead, but because you believed it had to be better than what you left behind. And sometimes it was. The soil was rich. The air felt new. In the middle of nowhere, people built homes from sod and lit fires from dried buffalo dung, and somehow they called it a new beginning. There was one moment, though, that changed everything. A whisper, a rumor, a flicker of metal in a stream. We will get to that soon. But for now, picture America in the early 1840s, a country that had doubled in size in just a few decades, a population that was spreading thin across an unforgiving landscape, a government trying to catch up to its own expansion, and a people, your grandparents, maybe mine, squinting into the distance, wondering just how far west they could go before the land said, no more. And then, the land said something else. It said gold, but we are not there just yet. Tonight we are still on the trail, still walking beside those wagons, feeling the ache in our legs and the hope in our chests. The wind is picking up, the prairie is quiet, and somewhere out there under the same stars, you can see tonight the first dreams of California are just beginning to stir. The lawless West. Before the law. The West before gold was not empty. That is something history sometimes forgets to mention. It was already alive with valleys carved by rivers, herds of buffalo thundering across open plains, and people who had called it home for generations. But to the east, where buildings rose in neat rows and streets had names, the West was a blank space. And for many blank spaces were invitations. In the years before the gold rush, the land beyond the Mississippi had no rules people recognized back home. There were no state lines, no courthouses, no men in uniforms riding quiet horses to enforce the law. What existed was something else entirely, what some called freedom and others called danger. The earliest Americans to settle those lands were a strange mix. Former soldiers, runaway debtors, dreamers and drifters, families too big for their cabins back east, men who had failed twice and believed the third time waited somewhere west of the Rockies. They brought very little with them, some tools, maybe a Bible, but always a gun. And for good reason. The West did not promise safety. There were no street lamps to keep the dark at bay, and no neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. Disputes were settled by whoever had a steadier hand or faster draw. A man could shoot another over a fence line or a stolen mule, and the prairie would swallow the sound before anyone asked a question. But it was not all gunfire and shadows. There were communities, strange and stubborn ones. People built towns without permission, hammered together saloons and schoolhouses side by side, as if whiskey and arithmetic were equally important. They gave themselves titles: sheriff, mayor, judge. No one appointed them, but no one challenged them either. When you live miles from the nearest authority, you learn to make your own. One of the most famous early settlements was Bent's Fort, built in what is now Colorado. It was not a fort in the military sense, but a trading post where native tribes, Mexicans, and American traders crossed paths. It smelled of animal hides, gunpowder, and horses. Deals were made in 3 languages and broken in half that time. But it worked somehow, because it had to. There were other places too. Places like Independence, Missouri, where trails began. St. Joseph, Council Bluffs. Towns that started as little more than supply stops then grew fat on the needs of passing travelers. If you could sharpen a plow, repair a wheel, or sell a decent bowl of stew, you could make a living. Not a fortune, but enough to keep moving west. Native tribes watched all this with growing unease. To them, this was not empty land being discovered. It was home, being carved apart acre by acre, under the weight of wagon wheels and unfamiliar footsteps. Some tribes tried to make peace, others did not, and who could blame them? Treaties were offered, signed, and broken with stunning speed. It is hard to trust a handshake when it disappears behind your back. You might wonder what kind of people chose to live in such places. Why not stay where things were safe and known? But the truth is, safety has never been the only measure of life. For some, the risk was worth it. A fresh start, a new name, a place where no one remembered what you had done or failed to do. I remember reading about a man who fled east after gambling away his father's land. He ended up near what is now Nevada, living in a tent with a dog and a rusted kettle. He was poor hungry most days and completely at peace. At least out here, he wrote, when I lose it is to the weather, not to men in suits. That line always stayed with me. By the mid-1840s, this lawless world was growing faster than anyone had predicted, and it was holding barely thanks to human grit and luck, more than any system. But there was something simmering just beneath the surface, something that would test all of it. These fragile towns, these makeshift rules, these hard-earned lives. Gold. It was not just a metal. It was a myth, a fever, a magnet. And when it finally appeared shimmering in a shallow stream at the edge of California, it did not just change the West. It exploded it. The quiet paths turned into highways of boots and hope. The towns swelled, the guns grew louder, and the law, such as it was, had to sprint just to catch its breath. But that is still a few steps ahead. For tonight we are still in that quieter West, the one built by hand without permission, by people who had nothing but time and stubbornness. The kind of place where a man could arrive with a scar and a story, and no one would ask which came first. The kind of place that would soon be buried under dust and gold and names we have long forgotten. The Mexican War and the gift called California, California was not always American. That seems obvious, but it is easy to forget. The stars and stripes were not always stitched into every hill and harbor. For a long time, the land that would become the Golden State belonged to someone else, Spain, then Mexico. And the transfer of that land, like so much in history, was not clean, not fair, and certainly not quiet. The Mexican-American War began in 1846, but its seeds were planted years before. You could feel the tension rising as more Americans moved west, settling in places they technically had no right to claim. Mexico watched nervously as its northern territories filled with new neighbors who spoke a different language and pledged loyalty to another flag. President James K. Polk, a man with a sharp jaw and sharper ambition, believed in something called manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was meant to stretch from sea to shining sea. He was not subtle about it. He wanted California, and he wanted it now. When Texas joined the Union in 1845, Mexico saw it as a provocation, and when American troops moved into disputed territory near the Rio Grande, a skirmish broke out. Just a few shots, a few lives. But Polk seized it as the reason he needed. Congress declared war, and soon American forces were pushing deep into Mexican land. The war lasted about 2 years. Battles raged from the deserts of New Mexico to the heart of Mexico City. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The United States had more money, more men, and more machines. In 1848, Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The price was steep. Over 500,000 square miles of land changed hands. It was one of the largest land transfers in American history. California was part of that deal, a ribbon of coastline with mountains, valleys, and endless sky. To many in Washington, it was valuable for its harbors. to merchants for its trade routes, to military mines for its distance from Europe. But few knew just how much lay beneath its surface. Not yet. Back then, California was sleepy. Small towns scattered like freckles across the map, Monterey, San Diego, Los Angeles, though that last one barely qualified as a town. Most of the land was mission territory built by Spanish priests and worked by native laborers. The architecture was adobe. The pace was slow. People raised cattle-tanned hides, lived close to the land. And then came the Americans. Some arrived with respect. Some did not. Treaties were made often in bad faith. Spanish-speaking landowners were promised their property would be protected, but that promise would fade with each new arrival. English became the language of courts. Land was divided, then redivided. New maps replaced old ones, and new laws favored those who could afford to understand them. Still, there was no rush. California was beautiful, but distant. The journey from the East Coast took months, either across the continent by wagon or by ship around the tip of South America. No railroad, no telegraph, just time and patience. And then by sheer accident, something happened that would crack the calm wide open. At the edge of the Sierra Nevada, a man named John Sutter had plans. He was building an agricultural empire, wheat fields, vineyards, and a sawmill near the American River. In early 1848, his carpenter James Marshall was checking the tail race of that mill when he saw something yellow glinting in the water. He picked it up, bit it like in stories. It did not bend, it did not break. It was gold. They tried to keep it quiet. Sutter was terrified of what gold might bring. He wanted workers, not fortune seekers. He told Marshall to say nothing, but secrets like rivers tend to run downhill. The story slipped out, then spread, gathering speed with each retelling. Still, in the early months, no one really believed it. Rumors of gold were not new, and California was so far away. But then came confirmation from newspapers, travelers, and government officials. By the end of 1848, even President Polk was talking about it. He held up a vial of California gold before Congress and said, in effect, "It is real." That was the spark, the match that lit the prairie. California was no longer just a gift of war. It was a promise of wealth. And not just any wealth, immediate, individual, and untaxed. You did not need land. You did not need education. Just a pan, a strong back, and a little luck. It sounded like a dream, and soon hundreds of thousands would chase it. But we are not there yet. Tonight, California still lies quiet. The hills are undisturbed. The rivers run clear. Sutter is still building his mill, and Marshall still thinks maybe they can keep the secret. They cannot. The world is waking up. James Marshall and the water that changed everything. The American River is not especially grand. It does not thunder or carve canyons like the Colorado. It just winds quietly through Northern California, sometimes blue, sometimes muddy, depending on the season. In January of 1848, it moved a little faster, swollen from winter rain, brushing past tree roots and rocks, unaware of what it was about to reveal. James Marshall was not searching for gold that morning. He was checking the sawmill, one he had been building for John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant with ambitions as wide as the valley. The mill was almost finished. Just a few more adjustments. The tail race, where water flowed out after turning the wheel, needed deepening. Marshall was walking beside it, watching how the water moved, when he saw something strange near the bottom. It caught the light. A flicker. Not shiny like a mirror, more muted, soft, like light through honey. He reached down. The piece was about the size of a coin, heavy for its size. He rubbed it between his fingers, squinted, then bit it. Gold. He was not certain not at first, but something in him must have known. He showed it to others at the camp. They found more pieces the next day, then more, and more still. Not in veins or massive nuggets, just flakes and specks scattered through the gravel, like secrets finally rising to the surface. Marshall rode back to tell Sutter, who was not pleased. Most people might imagine a man shouting with joy, throwing his hat into the air, dreaming of riches. But Sutter understood something deeper. Gold did not bring peace. It brought people, noise, claims, lawsuits, fights. His dream was a quiet empire farms mills trade. Gold would tear it apart. So they agreed to keep it secret. It did not work. Workers talked. Visitors noticed. One man filled his pockets with samples and rode to San Francisco. He showed them to a storekeeper named Samuel Brannan, a man with a flair for business and drama. Brannan knew what he was looking at. He said nothing at first. Instead, he bought every shovel, pickaxe, and pan he could find. Only then did he step into the streets with a vial of gold, held high, shouting, "Gold, gold," from the American River. And that was it. The rumor became a roar. But in those early weeks before the chaos, there was a strange calm, a liminal moment. The gold was real, but the rush had not begun. You could still walk the riverbanks without hearing another voice. You could still scoop a handful of gravel and find something glittering. No one had staked claims yet. No one had drawn lines in the dirt. There were no saloons, no tent cities, no gunfights over who saw what first. Just men bent over water, unsure whether to laugh or whisper. One man, a carpenter from Oregon, found 5 ounces in 2 days, worth more than a year's wages back home. Another picked a piece the size of his thumb from under a tree root. And all across the hills, quiet men began making quiet plans. But the world does not stay quiet for long. Ships began leaving New York and Boston, bound for California. Some went around Cape Horn, a brutal months-long journey through freezing waters. Others crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, swatting mosquitoes and risking disease just to board another ship on the Pacific side. Thousands took to the overland trails, old routes, suddenly thick with wagons, again churning dust from Missouri to the Sierra Nevada. They were all heading to the same place, a river, a rumor, a promise, and none of them knew just how much that promise would cost. Sutter never got his empire. Within a year, his land was swarmed by squatters. His fences were torn down. His cattle disappeared. Even his mill, the place where it all began, was abandoned. The very thing that could have made him rich gold left him broken. Marshall fared no better. He tried to stake a claim, but was overrun by newer arrivals. He became a symbol, not a success. People thanked him for discovering gold, but they rarely paid him for it. That is the strange thing about history. The ones who light the spark are often the ones who get burned. Still, in those first days before the newspapers caught on, before governments issued proclamations, before the hills turned to mud and tents, there was a moment, brief, quiet, golden, when a man could kneel beside a river and feel like he had touched something ancient, something waiting. It would not last. But for James Marshall on that cold morning in January, it was still simple. Just water, sunlight, and a glint in the gravel that made his breath catch in his throat. He probably did not realize that the entire course of the American West had just shifted under his feet. Rumors that sparked a global fever. At first, no one believed it. News of gold in California sounded too much like every other rumor that had drifted west over the years. There had been talk of silver in Arkansas, emeralds in Georgia, a lake made entirely of oil somewhere near Texas. Most of it had turned out to be stories, half-truths, wrapped in hope, told over campfires to pass the time. But this was different, because the gold kept coming. The first whispers circled around San Francisco, which at the time was barely more than a handful of buildings on a crooked shoreline. It had a few docks, a few shops, and not much else. But once Samuel Brannan walked through its muddy streets, shouting about the American River, everything changed. People abandoned their jobs. Soldiers deserted. Entire crews left ships, still floating in the harbor, rowed ashore and vanished into the hills. San Francisco, almost overnight, emptied of men and filled with rumors. Then the whispers caught a current. Letters began to trickle east, scribbled in haste on scraps of paper. Found gold by the river. Earning more in a week than I did all last year. Come quickly. These were not polished reports or official announcements. Just hurried notes, smudged by dirty fingers, sent to brothers and cousins and neighbors back home. Still doubt lingered. So in December 1848, President James K. Polk stood before Congress and confirmed it himself. He had seen the gold. He had it in his hand. It was real. That one sentence from a sitting president turned a local rumor into a national obsession. By early 1849, the United States was in motion. Men from New England farms, Appalachian valleys, crowded New York boarding houses, they all started packing. Some left in the dead of winter. Some tried to wait for spring. They sold watches, borrowed money, abandoned families. The lure was too strong, not just because it was gold, because it was gold you could find with your own hands. The stories were everywhere. A man who dug a hole for a fire pit and found a nugget the size of a walnut. A cook who earned more in 3 days than his employer did in 3 months. Gold, it seemed, was not hiding. It was waiting. And so the rush began. Ships departed from every major port on the East Coast. The trip around Cape Horn could take 6 months, months of bad food, violent storms, and boredom so deep it made men carve chessboards into the floorboards. Others tried the route through Panama, not yet connected by canal, but shorter, if you could survive the jungle. For those with even fewer options, the path was overland. Thousands of miles of dust heat and rivers with no bridges. The Oregon Trail was the skeleton of the route. California was the new destination. And it was not just Americans. Word crossed the oceans. From Chile, men set sail with mining tools and Catholic medals tucked into their belts. From China, fathers kissed children goodbye and boarded crowded junks bound for San Francisco Bay. Australians, Germans, Mexicans, Frenchmen, even a few from Hawaii. It was the first truly global gold rush, and none of them really knew what they would find. There were no official maps, no directions, no welcome signs, just rumor, layered on rumor. Some said the hills were made of gold dust. Others claimed you could pull it from tree bark. Most brought little more than a shovel, a sack of beans, and a desperate sort of faith. Faith that the river would still be there. Faith that the stories were not just stories. Faith that the gold had not already been taken by someone faster. What they found was something else entirely. Chaos. The camps were growing fast, too fast. Towns sprang up with no plan, no law, no sanitation. Tents and lean-tos covered the hillsides. Prices exploded. A pickaxe that cost $2 back east might sell for $40 in the camps. Eggs were $1 apiece. Water, when it was clean, was worth more than beer. And yet, they kept coming. Because every now and then, someone did strike it rich. Someone did find a vein. Someone did walk into camp with gold in his hat, gold in his boots, gold caked under his fingernails. That was enough. Enough to keep the fires burning. Enough to keep the wagons rolling. Enough to make the world forget how far California really was. Back east, editors wrote headlines in big, bold type. California gold confirmed. Riches for the taking. The American Riverland of miracles. And the papers sold out. not just in Boston or Philadelphia, but in London, in Paris, in Shanghai. California, once a quiet province at the edge of Mexico, was now the center of the universe. But no one stopped to ask what that might mean for the land, for the people who already lived there, or for the men who would leave everything behind to chase a shimmer in the water. That part of the story comes later. For now, imagine yourself standing at a dock, holding a small bag, saying goodbye, maybe for the last time, climbing onto a ship with strangers, knowing that ahead of you lies the Pacific, and beyond that, a chance at gold, a chance at something more, a chance that might never come again. The Mad Migrations. By the spring of 1849, the roads heading west were no longer quiet. They trembled under the weight of dreams. They called themselves the 49ers, though most of them had never mined a day in their lives. Farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, teachers, men who sold everything they had, farms, homes, wedding rings, and packed what was left into wagons, barrels, and pockets. Some traveled in groups, others went alone. They followed the sun westward, toward a place they had never seen, drawn by second-hand stories and third-hand maps. For many, it was the first time they had ever left home. They were not explorers. They were believers. The journey was long before it was golden. Overland travelers left from jumping-off points like Independence, Missouri, or Council Bluffs, Iowa. The trails snaked through plains and mountains, deserts and river valleys. There were no highways, only ruts. Ruts carved by other wagons, worn deeper each year until they became paths that moved people more than people moved them. A good day meant 15 miles. A bad day meant broken wheels, dead oxen, and prayers muttered into the dirt. And there were many bad days. Disease rode with them. Cholera struck in sudden waves, emptying bodies of water and color in just hours. Graves dotted the sides of the trail, some marked with wooden crosses, others with nothing at all. Babies were born. Elders died. Families changed before they reached California. Some travelers tried to lighten the journey with song, with stories, with the occasional fiddle pulled from a crate. But mostly there was the sound of walking. Boots on hard ground, wheels squeaking, children crying, and always the wind. Others chose the sea. Ships left from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, even New Orleans. Some took the long way around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, where waves could rise like walls and slam against wooden hulls with terrifying force. The journey could last 5 months or more. Storms, sickness, rotting food, rats in the grain. Some ships never arrived. The faster route, at least in theory, was through Panama. Sail to the eastern coast, disembark, and cross the isthmus on foot or by mule. Jungle heat, mosquitoes like clouds. Then wait for another ship on the Pacific side, if there was room, if you survived the crossing, if no one else had bribed their way aboard first. Even those who made it to California did not arrive where they needed to be. San Francisco was the first stop, but the gold was still hundreds of miles inland. More walking, more riding, more risk. Some came from as far as China, others from Peru, Australia, France. They brought their languages, their customs, their own ideas of luck and hard work. They stepped off boats with eyes wide and chests full of breath they had held the entire journey. The moment their boots hit California soil, they were equals in only one way. None of them knew what would happen next. One man wrote in his journal that the land felt thick with possibility. Another called it a furnace of men. The hills filled with tense voices and the clink of metal against stone. And always someone shouting, either with joy or pain or warning. In some places the streams glittered. Gold dust clung to fingertips. Nuggets rolled out from under rocks. It was real. but not everywhere. Many rivers had already been panned. Some had never held gold at all. Men wandered from site to site, chasing rumors, leaving behind camps like empty cocoons. Fortunes were made and lost in a matter of days. Those who arrived early had the best luck. They could walk into a river and scoop handfuls of gravel that sparkled. But by summer of 1849, there were too many hands and not enough river. The easy gold was already thinning. The rest would require more effort, more tools, more time. That did not stop anyone, because the gold was only part of the story. What drove people was something deeper, a need to change their lives in a single act, to erase failure, to rewrite family histories, to prove maybe just once that fortune favored the bold. Of course, not everyone came for gold. Some followed their husbands, hoping to build homes once the camps became towns. Some came to sell things: coffee, boots, blankets, whiskey. A few just wanted to disappear, and the West, still lawless in many corners, offered space for people to become new versions of themselves. The migration was so large, so sudden, that California's population exploded. It tripled, then quadrupled within a year. Roads appeared where there had been nothing but sagebrush. Rivers were bridged. Hills were scarred with trails and claims and the footprints of strangers. And underneath it all, the land groaned. It had never been asked permission, never agreed to be carved up and claimed. But it bore the weight of this new arrival, the rush, the fever, the desperate hunger to find something solid beneath the surface. Back east, towns felt quieter. Empty chairs, empty classrooms. Letters took months to arrive, and when they did, they spoke of mud, money, violence, and hope. Parents prayed, wives waited, brothers saved what they could to follow. California was no longer a state in the making. It was a magnet, a myth, a furnace, and every day more boots stepped into the dust, hoping to be the next ones to strike gold. The 49ers and a city built from dust, San Francisco, before the gold was quiet. Just a sleepy port tucked between hills and fog. A few hundred people lived there, fishermen, traders, some former soldiers. The streets were mostly dirt. The buildings low and wide, made of wood that creaked in the wind. Locals still called it Yerba Buena, good herb, a name left over from its Mexican past. Then the gold was found, and the world crashed through its front door. By the middle of 1849, ships began pouring into the bay. So many that sailors joked you could walk from one deck to another without touching water. Some ships were never claimed abandoned by crews who ran off in search of fortune the moment they hit land. They bobbed in the harbor like skeletons, their masts swaying slowly, turning into floating warehouses, hotels, or just rot. On shore, San Francisco transformed. But not gently. It exploded. The population ballooned from a few hundred to tens of thousands. Streets that had once echoed with footsteps were now choked with shouting, laughter, gunshots, and hammering. Buildings went up in days, saloons, boarding houses, gambling halls, and stores selling everything from lantern oil to pickled eggs. Some were barely more than tents with wooden signs nailed to them. Others were ambitious 2 stories high with glass windows that gleamed like gold themselves. But the city was not ready. There was no sanitation, no zoning, no police force strong enough to tame the chaos. Fires broke out constantly, some from carelessness, others from disputes. In one single year, the city burned to the ground 6 times, and 6 times it was rebuilt. Faster, taller, wilder. They called themselves the 49ers, these new arrivals. But the nickname quickly came to mean more than a year. It meant a type of person. A 49er was someone who chased risk, who drank hard and worked harder, who slept little and fought often. He might have been a banker back east, a farmer from Tennessee, a sailor from Liverpool. Out here, they were all the same, covered in dust eyes, sharp from squinting at riverbeds, hands calloused from shovels and picks. Most of them never struck it rich. That is something the legends often forget to mention. The easy gold was gone within months. The rest hid deeper beneath rock behind river bends underground, too stubborn to give up its treasure without a fight. But still they came. They mined by day, drank by night, and in between they built a city that seemed always on the verge of falling apart. Prices in San Francisco made no sense. A single egg could cost the same as a steak dinner in New York. Boots were worth more than rifles. A cup of coffee might cost more than your wages for the day. But if you complained, someone would point at the harbor, at the hills, at the men hauling gold in flour sacks, and ask, "Do you want to go back?" No one did, because San Francisco was not just a stop anymore. It was the mouth of the goldfields, the place where journeys ended and new ones began. The last slice of civilization before the wilderness of fortune. And it was not only men who came. Women, though fewer, began arriving as well. Some followed husbands, others came alone, drawn by the same rumors. A few saw opportunity, not in gold, but in those who sought it. They opened boarding houses, laundries, restaurants. They sold pies, wrote letters, cleaned clothes so caked in mud they cracked when dry. Many made more money than the miners they served. Children, too, walked the streets, some with parents, others alone, orphaned, or sent by desperate families, hoping they might find a better life. They shined shoes, sold newspapers, carried messages between camps. They grew up fast, learning quickly which alleyways were safe, which faces meant danger. There was no real law, not yet, just a patchwork of rules enforced by volunteers with more courage than authority. Disputes were settled with fists, knives, pistols, or sometimes just a stare strong enough to make someone walk away. Jails were improvised. Judges were elected by voice vote, sometimes while drinking. The line between order and chaos was thin as a pickaxe handle. But San Francisco kept growing. Because beneath the grime, the noise, the reckless speed, it worked. Somehow it worked. Ships arrived. Cargo moved. Letters were sent. Gold flowed in and out like a tide. And every time the city burned, it rose again. Ash, still warm timbers, still smoking as new walls went up. It was not pretty. It was not safe. But it was alive. Alive in a way most places never dared to be. Alive in a way that made men write home and say, "You have to see this. You have to come." And so they came. By foot, by horse, by boat, by hope. Some stayed, some fled, some got rich, some disappeared, but all of them for a time passed through that wild, crooked, roaring place at the edge of the continent, a city built from dust and noise and dreams holding on by its fingernails, to the idea that somewhere just over the next hill lay something worth everything. Who really got rich? When people imagine the gold rush, they often picture the miner, shirt rolled to the elbows, face sunburned, pants dusty and wet to the knees, standing knee-deep in a river swirling a pan, waiting for the glitter. Sometimes they found it. Often they did not. The truth is, the miner rarely became the millionaire. Most of them spent their days chasing flakes, bits of gold so small you could lose them between your fingernails. They dug in cold water, swung picks until their hands bled, and fell asleep on the ground. If they struck something, it usually vanished just as fast, spent on food, tools, drink, or a new claim that led nowhere. But someone else was always waiting nearby, watching, selling. Those were the ones who got rich, the merchants, the hoteliers, the outfitters. People who realized early that the real gold was not in the ground, it was in the miners. Levi Strauss was one of them. He arrived not with a pan or a shovel, but with rolls of heavy canvas. His plan was to sell tents and wagon covers, but miners kept tearing their pants in the rocks, so Strauss hired a tailor and made something new, work trousers with copper rivets and extra strong stitching. They were called waist overalls back then. Today we call them jeans. He never dug for gold, but he built a company that still exists long after the mines dried up. There was also Samuel Brannan, the man who shouted gold in the streets of San Francisco. He was not a miner either. Before making his announcement, he bought every pick, shovel, and pan he could find. When the rush began, he sold them at enormous markups. A tool that cost 20 cents in the East might sell for $15 at his shop. He made more money in a few months than most miners could dream of, and he never got his boots wet. All across California, others followed suit. A man with a barrel of eggs could name his price. A woman with a clean bed and a hot meal could turn a tent into a hotel. Lumbermen saw their fortunes rise as cities and camps needed wood faster than trees could grow. Teamsters drivers who hauled goods with oxen and wagons earned more per mile than riverboat captains back east. Blacksmiths, cooks, laundresses, entertainers, anyone who offered relief from the hunger cold or loneliness of the goldfields stood to gain. Mining, in truth, was the hardest road. It required strength, luck, and constant movement. Rivers ran out, claims dried up. The next hill always seemed to shimmer brighter. Men wandered from camp to camp, chasing rumors, staking claims, digging holes that led nowhere. They fought over land, over tools, over lies. They borrowed and begged, and when that failed, stole. Some disappeared into the wilderness. Others took jobs with better odds hauling freight, cutting wood, washing dishes. But the dream kept going, because even as thousands failed, someone somewhere struck gold. And when they did, they showed it. A nugget the size of a walnut, a pouch so heavy it strained the seams. They paid in gold dust, threw coins onto counters like buttons. The sight of it was enough to keep the rest digging, and so the cycle spun. Most miners lost money. Some broke even. A few, a very lucky few, made enough to go home and buy land, open stores, start families. But they were the exception. The real wealth was made on the edges, in kitchens, in shops, behind bars, behind desks, behind mules, pulling wagons loaded with supplies. And yet the miners kept coming. Because hope is not logical. It does not run the numbers. It sees the man next to you find something in the river and says, "That could be me." Hope listens to stories, not statistics. It says, "Just one more try." So, they kept trying. Every morning the camps came alive with coughing, with the clatter of pans, with boots sliding down muddy trails. They lit fires with damp wood, drank coffee, thick with grounds, and walked back to the water. And at night they counted what they found. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was just enough to try again. Back home, people saw only the headlines. Fortune found, another lucky strike. They did not see the men with sore backs and empty hands. They did not see the broken teeth, the frostbitten toes, the letters that went unanswered. They saw the gold, not the gamble. That was part of the myth, that anyone could get rich. But the deeper truth was quieter, tucked behind saloon doors and dry goods counters. The ones who got rich were the ones who sold shovels, not the ones who dug with them. Gold violence and the absence of law. The gold rush did not just bring people, it brought tension. Too many people too fast, and not enough rules to hold them together. In the hills and valleys of California, where thousands of men scratched at the earth each day, law was not just thin, it was often missing entirely. There were no police, no formal courts, no governors in the early days. just men with shovels and rifles, crowding around claims, staked with twigs and string, shouting about who had arrived first. When tempers flared, and they often did, justice was swift and personal. Sometimes a disagreement ended with harsh words and a walk in opposite directions, but more often it ended with fists or knives, or the crack of a pistol, across an open field. The quiet rivers where gold was found also became the silent witnesses of men who disappeared without a trace. If you found gold, you kept it, but only if you could defend it. Camps tried to keep order. Some elected judges from among their own. Others drafted codes, handwritten laws, tacked to trees, or posted on saloon doors. They called them mining codes or camp laws, but they held power only as long as someone was willing to enforce them. A man accused of theft might be tried under a pine tree, sentenced in 10 minutes, and punished with a whipping or worse. Horse thieves were hanged. Cheaters at cards might be driven out of camp, stripped of their boots, and left to walk barefoot for miles. And if a man killed another over a claim, the verdict often depended more on popularity than evidence. It was not justice in the legal sense. It was survival. And it was messy. Vigilante groups formed, some noble, others cruel. They called themselves committees of safety or citizens' guards. In theory, they protected miners from crime. In practice, they often became enforcers of suspicion, prejudice, and panic. In San Francisco, the most famous of these was the Vigilance Committee of 1851. It rose out of frustration with corruption and crime, and within months had arrested dozens, deported many, and executed a few. They operated without official approval, but with public support. People were scared, and when fear mixes with power lines blur. Theft was common in the camps. A single pouch of gold dust could vanish with a moment's distraction. Miners began sleeping with their boots on their rifles within reach. Tents were double-stitched. Holes were dug beneath bedrolls to hide what little treasure they had found. Disputes over claims were worse. Land was rarely surveyed. Boundaries were made with stones or branches. If a man staked a spot and another dug there the next morning, the argument could spiral in seconds. Sometimes it ended with a handshake, sometimes with blood. And still more people came, because for all the violence, for all the lawlessness, the idea of gold still shimmered, still pulled, still promised. Not everyone was armed. Not everyone was dangerous. Many miners lived side by side in peace, sharing meals, trading supplies, watching out for one another. But peace in the camps was fragile, and it could be broken by something as small as a rumor. One miner overhearing another brag about a new vein. One stranger wandering too close to someone's stake. One card turned the wrong way in a dusty saloon. The lack of structure created a strange kind of society. Men who had never spoken before became partners. Strangers shared tents. A man could be a cook one week, a miner the next, and a merchant the week after. Identities were fluid. Histories were blurred. First names mattered more than last ones, and in the absence of formal law, reputation filled the gap. A man known to be fair might be asked to settle disputes. A man known to be violent might be left alone. Word spread quickly and sometimes unfairly. Accusations stuck. Apologies did not. Then there were the gamblers. They followed the miners from town to town, dealing cards on crates and barrels, offering chance to men who had already risked everything. Some gamblers were slick and practiced. Others were desperate and dangerous. The line between entertainment and robbery could vanish before a hand was played. Saloons became the heartbeat of many camps. Lit by candles, thick with smoke, they offered warmth, drink, and distraction. Music, when there was any, came from pianos missing keys or fiddles played by tired fingers. Conversations were loud laughter, quick tempers quicker. And always, there was the weight of gold. Gold in pockets, gold behind bars, gold buried in the floorboards. It made men generous and greedy in the same breath. It lifted spirits and broke friendships. It made the strong feel invincible and the weak feel forgotten. It distorted everything. And without law, gold decided who lived well and who simply lived. Yet even in the chaos, something was forming. Slowly, unevenly, towns began organizing councils. Merchants posted prices. Miners' associations emerged to settle disputes before they turned violent. California was still wild, but it was learning to breathe in patterns. It would take years to tame. And even then, some parts never truly would. Because in those first fevered months, when thousands of strangers carved lives into a land with no rules, the Wild West was not a phrase, it was a fact. The first women and the price of presence. For a long time, the gold rush was a world of men, miners, merchants, gamblers, thieves. The camps echoed with voices that rasped from dust and drink. But not many were female. In 1849, it is estimated that less than 5% of California's non-indigenous population were women. In some mining camps, there might be 100 men, for every woman, sometimes more. It shaped everything. When a woman did arrive, she was noticed, watched, talked about before she even spoke. Some were wives making impossible journeys across mountains to reunite with husbands who had gone west months or years before. They arrived in mud-covered boots, clutching children, having faced the same dangers as any man on the trail. Others came alone, pulled by the same hunger for fortune, though they were rarely allowed to dig for it. And still others came for opportunity, not in gold, but in the men chasing it. The economics of imbalance were immediate. In a town where a decent meal was rare, and a soft voice even rarer, a woman who could cook or clean or simply sit and listen was suddenly indispensable. A woman running a boarding house might charge more than a miner could afford. A laundress could name her price. A woman who baked pies, who mended shirts, who ran a saloon, all could make money faster and with more consistency than most men panning a river. One woman, Lucina Wilson, arrived in Sacramento in 1849 and opened a hotel out of a canvas tent. She served simple meals, beans, bread, coffee. Her first night, she made more than her husband had seen in a week of trading. By the end of the month, she was hiring help. Women who offered companionship, real or perceived, found no shortage of attention. Dances were held where a single woman might spend the evening switching partners every song, while the men lined the walls, waiting their turn. They brought gifts. They wrote poems. They fought. It was not always romantic. Often it was lonely. Many women described being stared at in silence, being followed, being spoken about not to, and always being watched. The weight of scarcity turned attention into pressure. Every glance felt loaded, every smile strategic. For some, it was empowering. For others, exhausting. There were women who took to the work of mining. Few, but they existed. They wore trousers, carried picks, filed claims under their own names, but they faced skepticism, even scorn. The goldfields were not kind to those who broke norms. Still, some found success, especially those who worked quietly, steadily away from the crowds. And there were women whose presence sparked anger. In a place where so many were poor, struggling and desperate, any sign of comfort stood out. A woman in a clean dress walking with confidence could draw resentment as much as admiration. Whispers followed, sometimes worse. The camps were not safe. Not for anyone, but especially not for women. There were no guarantees, no protections. Assaults happened. Threats were common. Some women traveled with weapons, others with large dogs. A few only went out during daylight, and even then rarely alone. But they stayed. They built businesses, opened schools, planted gardens in soil turned over by greed. Some organized churches. Others wrote letters home, long, elegant letters that described in careful detail a world almost beyond belief. They became historians without knowing it, documenting the gold rush in a way men rarely did. One wrote, "I live among strangers, but every day I claim a little piece of this land by washing it, cooking on it, and refusing to leave." Their presence softened some edges. Tents became cabins, camps became neighborhoods, streets were named, windows added curtains, men began shaving again, combing their hair. There were still saloons, still gunfights, but now there were also sewing circles and Sunday gatherings. Children began to appear. Some were born in wagons, others in makeshift hospitals with walls barely strong enough to keep out the wind. They were the first native Californians of the goldfields, and their mothers, whether newly arrived or long enduring, became something more than survivors. They became settlers, homemakers in the truest sense, not just of buildings, but of community. Still, for all the change, the ratio remained lopsided for years. Men outnumbered women dramatically through the 1850s, and so the imbalance continued to shape everything: relationships, power, violence, opportunity. A woman's reputation could be her most valuable possession, or her most dangerous. Some reinvented themselves entirely, choosing new names, new pasts, new futures. In California, few asked where you came from. They were more interested in what you could do. And the women of the gold rush proved again and again that they could do more than anyone expected. They were not background figures. They were central, not just to the kitchens and shops, but to the idea that this rush, this chaos, this gold-fueled migration might actually turn into something that lasted. Not just a fortune, but a place. The Chinese arrive, and the welcome fades. They came by ship, across the Pacific from southern China, drawn by the same word that pulled men from Boston, Dublin, and Santiago gold. The Chinese called California Gum Sand Gold Mountain. In letters sent home, it sounded like a place where money hung in the air, ready to be plucked. A place where a man could work hard, save enough, and return with dignity and gifts for his family. For many, that was the plan. A few years abroad. A better life at home. They were not wrong to dream, but California would not greet them kindly. The first Chinese migrants arrived in small numbers during the late 1840s, but by 1852, that number had surged to over $20,000, mostly young men, from Guangdong province fleeing war, poverty, and famine. Many spoke little or no English. They brought tools, rice-dried fish, and their hopes. At first they were tolerated, not welcomed, not celebrated, just tolerated. They kept to themselves, built their own camps near the rivers, worked with a quiet discipline that some found admirable, others suspicious. Where American miners worked in pairs or small groups, the Chinese often organized in larger teams. They cleaned abandoned claims, reworked gravel others had dismissed, and sometimes they found gold. That was when the mood began to shift. Success in the goldfields was not just about money, it was about pride. And when Chinese workers succeeded, white miners began to resent them. Rumors spread. Accusations multiplied. They were called sneaky, accused of cheating, of stealing gold that should have gone to Americans. But the law offered no protection. In fact, it often turned against them. In 1850, California passed the foreign miners' tax, charging non-citizen miners $20 a month just to dig. For many Chinese workers, that was more than they earned. The tax was selectively enforced, often by local authorities eager to pocket the money. And when a man could not pay, his tools might be taken, or worse. Violence followed. Chinese camps were raided, tents burned, miners beaten, sometimes killed. Complaints to authorities went nowhere. Chinese immigrants were barred from testifying in court against white citizens, which meant legally they could be harmed with little fear of consequence. Still, they stayed, because even in the face of injustice, California still held possibility. Gold could still be found, and where gold failed work could be found elsewhere. Chinese immigrants began taking on jobs other miners refused: laundry, cooking, farming, railroad labor. They sent money home carefully in small amounts, and slowly they built something more durable than a fortune. They built community. Chinatowns began to form, not just in San Francisco, but in Sacramento, Stockton, and dozens of smaller towns. They were dense, colorful, full of life. Lanterns lit narrow alleys. Herbal shops opened beside temples. Markets sold dried mushrooms, duck eggs, ginger root, and tiny bundles of tea wrapped in cloth. Inside there was safety, a language shared, a meal familiar, a space to breathe without being watched. Outside, the climate worsened. Newspapers printed cartoons mocking the Chinese, painting them as strange, dangerous, inhuman. Politicians began using anti-Chinese rhetoric to win votes from angry miners who had failed to strike gold, and vigilante groups saw in the Chinese a target too vulnerable to fight back. One story tells of a Chinese miner who was beaten, robbed, and thrown into a river. The men who did it were never charged. Another man, too injured to work, was denied hospital care. He died within a week. And yet, despite everything, many stayed. Because what was the alternative? Some had sold everything to come. Others had borrowed from relatives, neighbors, entire villages. Going home empty-handed was unthinkable, dishonorable. So they endured. They worked longer, dug deeper, saved more. And over time, something else happened. They changed California. Not with gold, but with presence. With food, with language, with labor. They helped build railroads, tended vineyards, opened shops and schools. They brought festivals bright with firecrackers, drums, and silk. They brought stories, medicines, songs. The gold rush would not last forever, but the Chinese presence in California would. They were not just passers-by in someone else's story. They were builders of it, even when they were not invited, even when the welcome faded, even when the law turned cold. They kept going, because the dream of Gold Mountain, however battered, still held a glimmer. The railroad and the bones beneath it. You could hear it coming before you saw it. A low rumble at first, then a sharp whistle that pierced the mountain air. By the time the train came into view, black smoke curling above the treetops, it already felt like the future had arrived. Steel wheels on steel rails slicing through the wilderness like a promise. But promises have a cost, and sometimes that cost is buried deep. After the gold began to fade, California faced a question. How do we keep growing without new gold? The answer many believed was connection, a railroad that stretched across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, linking east and west in one long steel spine. It was ambitious, grand, dangerous, and it would never have happened without thousands of laborers, most of them Chinese. The Central Pacific Railroad began building eastward from Sacramento in 1863. The Sierra Nevada stood directly in its path, massive, rocky, snow-choked. American workers, mostly white, had tried blasting through the mountains. Many quit within weeks. The railroad company turned to Chinese laborers. At first, people said they were too small, too weak, not suited for such brutal work. But when pay was offered less than what white workers made, but steady thousands signed up. They wore wide straw hats and cotton tunics. They brought their own food, rice, dried vegetables, tea. They worked quietly, efficiently, in crews that sometimes stretched for miles, each man with a task. Some laid track, some swung pickaxes, others handled the nitroglycerin. That part was the most dangerous. Blasting tunnels through solid granite meant packing powder into deep holes, lighting a fuse, and running. If the timing was wrong, if a fuse burned too fast, or the charge failed to clear properly, men died. Sometimes they disappeared completely, just dust and silence. Winter was worse. In the Sierra, snow could fall 20 feet deep. Storms came fast, burying camps, swallowing whole supply lines. Workers built snow sheds to protect the tracks. They shoveled every morning, then again in the afternoon. Fingers turned purple. Eyes froze shut. Still they worked. No newspapers celebrated them. No towns were named after them. But the track kept growing. Mile after mile, inch by inch, through the heart of the mountains. They called the toughest section, Cape Horn, a cliff face, where men were lowered in baskets to carve a ledge into the rock. One wrong move meant a fall of 1,000 feet, and yet they kept at it, because quitting meant hunger, and hunger meant worse. They slept in tents or makeshift bunkhouses, sometimes carved directly into snowbanks. On Sundays they boiled tea and mended clothes. Some wrote letters home. Others gambled or smoked pipes or told stories of wives and children they had not seen in years. And the work continued. By 1869, the tracks of the Central Pacific met the Union Pacific in Promontory, Utah. A golden spike was driven into the ground. Men in suits posed for photographs. Flags waved. History was made. But in those photos you will not find the Chinese workers. They were told to step aside, to wait, to disappear. Their faces are not in the official record, but their hands built the railroad. Their backs carried it across mountains. Their bones, some say, still lie beneath the snow sheds and tunnels in unmarked graves along the line. Estimates vary, but historians believe over 1,000 Chinese workers died building the railroad. There were no monuments, no compensation for families, just silence. And yet the track held. It carried passengers, freight, letters from loved ones, dreams in the form of cattle oranges, lumber coal. The American West, once wild and distant, was now just a few days away, by train. California changed again. Cities grew, trade boomed, and the country, now truly continental, turned its gaze outward, toward the Pacific, toward empire. But behind the engine's whistle, if you listen closely, there is something else. A memory, maybe, of hands that held iron, feet that trudged through snow, faces that were never photographed, but shaped the land all the same. Not with glory, but with grit. Not with fame, but with endurance. Not remembered, but not forgotten either. Not tonight. The lawless gold and the law that followed. There was a time when California felt like it had no rules. The kind of place where a man could vanish under a false name, open a saloon in the morning, and lose it in a poker game by nightfall. Gunsmoke in the air, whiskey in every breath, and justice depending on whether the sheriff was sober that week. They called it the Wild West for a reason. After the gold rush, after the railroad, California was bursting at the seams. New towns sprang up like weeds, each one promising fortune, or at least a chance to start over. But when people arrive faster than laws do, trouble usually finds its way in. Take San Francisco. By the 1850s, it had gone from a sleepy port to a booming, chaotic city, full of gamblers, hustlers, and dreamers. The docks were crowded with ships that had been abandoned by crews who ran off to the hills the moment they heard about gold. Some of those ships were turned into hotels. Others sank where they floated forgotten, beneath what would later become city streets. And above those streets, a mess of wooden buildings, loud saloons and makeshift theaters. Men fought over claims, over women, over spilled drinks. There were no real police, no real courts, just vigilante groups with rope and guns deciding right and wrong by vote. It was not just San Francisco. Down south in Los Angeles, still just a dusty town of a few thousand murders happened so often that locals called it the City of Angels, with the devil's sense of humor. Ranchers clashed with squatters. Native Californians pushed to the edges of their own land were treated like intruders. And Chinese immigrants, despite building the railroad, were targeted by laws that stripped them of rights. The violence was not always criminal. Sometimes it came dressed in a badge. Local militias, often made up of former soldiers, acted as lawmen when it suited them. They broke up strikes, cleared out camps, enforced land grabs. The line between sheriff and outlaw blurred more than once. It was a dangerous time to be powerless, and many were. But California was changing. As railroads brought more people and more money, the state realized it needed more than gold and grit. It needed structure, government, order. And so the laws began to arrive. Courthouses were built, judges appointed, statehood brought a constitution. And with it came new rules about property, about marriage, about who counted as a citizen and who did not. It was not always fair. Not at all. The legal system was shaped by those who already had land money and influence. Many of the miners and laborers who had carved out California's foundation found themselves edged out. Claims were challenged, taxes were levied. The same towns that once welcomed them with open arms now passed ordinances that pushed them aside. For Chinese immigrants, it became even harder. They were not allowed to testify against white citizens in court. That meant if someone attacked them, stole from them, or worse, they had no legal recourse. Entire communities were burned down, and no one was punished. And yet they stayed. They built Chinatowns, temples, schools. They opened shops and raised families. They carved out a place for themselves in a state that often wished they would vanish. In the North, freed African Americans formed small enclaves, two people who had fled slavery or come west in search of dignity. They faced discrimination, violence, and suspicion. But they founded churches, newspapers, and mutual aid societies. They left their mark even when the history books forgot to write them in. Mexican Californians who had owned the land before statehood were also caught in the tide. Some lost everything to legal battles they could not win. Others stayed on their ranchos watching the hills fill with fences, strangers and surveyors with new maps. California's promise had never been equal. But it was still magnetic. People kept coming. Artists, inventors, runaways. Every train brought more stories, more hopes, more trouble. And slowly the state began to settle, not into peace exactly, but into a rhythm. Streetcars replaced wagons, telegraph wires hummed with distant voices, schools opened, newspapers published, and even the saloons got a little quieter. Some say the West was tamed, but maybe that is not the right word. Maybe it just exhaled. The law had come, sometimes late, often flawed, but it came. And beneath its slow arrival, beneath the violence and the struggle, something else was happening. A culture was taking shape. A California that was not just about gold or railroads or wide-open land, but about complexity, about contradictions, about the people who stayed even when the dream faded. They built not just homes, but histories. They made mistakes, found love, held grudges, buried secrets. They raised children who would never know a world without railroads, without cities, without stories, told by candlelight. And if you had walked through one of those towns, just as the sun was setting, you might have heard a piano playing behind a saloon door, a baby crying, a man laughing too hard at something that was not funny. Life, unfinished, unpolished, but real. And in the end, maybe that is what the law was, for not to stop the Wild West, but to hold it still long enough for someone to remember it. The schools, the saints, and the silent divides. By the late 1870s, California had begun to look less like a frontier and more like a country within a country. The towns had names now: San Jose, Fresno, Modesto, and some of them even had newspapers that came out on time. Farmers fenced their land, schoolhouses were painted white, and the railroad had made sure that no place stayed quiet for long. But just because it looked settled did not mean it felt that way. Behind the polished storefronts and the Sunday churches, California was still figuring itself out. It was a place of beginnings, but also a place of frictions. People had arrived with different dreams, and dreams do not always get along. On one hand, you had the educators and reformers. They came west with books in their trunks and ideals in their hearts, mostly from the East Coast. They believed in progress, in rules, in clean sidewalks and classical music. They opened schools and libraries. They founded universities. They drew inspiration from places like Boston, but hoped California could be something brighter. You could hear their vision in the schoolyards: little girls reciting poetry, boys copying Latin verbs on slates, bells ringing at exactly 9. There was a sense that education could turn wild land into gentle minds, and in many ways it worked. Stanford University was founded. So was the University of California. Places where science and philosophy mingled with the smell of eucalyptus and new books. Places where the children of gold miners sat beside the children of senators. But California did not belong to just one vision. Further south, the old missions still stood faded but stubborn. Founded by Spanish priests 100 years earlier, they were once the only places with stone walls and locked doors. They had brought Catholicism, farming, and European names to a land that already had its own rhythms. Now the missions were half ruin, half museum. Tourists stared at the cracked adobe walls. Schoolchildren took field trips there and learned about Father Sarah and his long walks. But the deeper stories, the forced conversions, the diseases, the lost languages, those were often whispered or not told at all. Native Californians, what few remained, were rarely in the photographs. And then there were the Chinese. After building the railroad, many had stayed, some opening shops, others working the fields, or cooking in restaurants that blended East and West in strange but delicious ways. But they were still treated like strangers. In San Francisco, Chinatown was vibrant and colorful, but it was also fenced in by fear. Laws barred Chinese families from owning land or sending their children to the same schools as white families. And still, they taught their children. In back rooms behind silk curtains, old men with long beards taught calligraphy and Confucian ethics. Young girls learned to read characters no one else in the city could understand. They lit incense. They celebrated Lunar New Year with dragons and drums that echoed into alleyways. Two worlds side by side. One visible, one politely ignored. Up north, the divide was more about money. The railroads had turned some men into millionaires. They built mansions on hills, held parties with champagne and string quartets. They dressed their wives in Parisian gowns and sent their children to boarding schools back east. Just a few miles away, laborers picked fruit in the valley heat. No shoes, no pay if it rained, no one asking their names. California had always promised opportunity, but by the 1880s, it was clear that opportunity had a ticket price, and not everyone could afford it. And yet, the dream lingered. Writers began to arrive. Mark Twain visited the state and declared that California weather was better than heaven's. Artists painted hillsides in soft golds and purples, and photographers captured redwood trees so tall they made humans look like ants. Some people believed California could become the new Athens, a land of light and learning. Others saw it as a place to disappear, but most quietly, just tried to live. They went to church on Sundays, to the saloon on Fridays. They fell in love at barn dances. They buried their parents in cemeteries with views of the ocean. They taught their kids to spell California before they could find it on a map. The state was no longer just a destination. It was home. But like many homes, it had rooms that did not talk to each other. English and Spanish, Cantonese and silence, wealth and labor, belief and memory. And underneath it all, a question that no one said out loud, but everyone lived. Who gets to shape this place? The farmers, the priests, the teachers, the railroad barons, or the quiet ones who cooked the meals, dug the wells, swept the floors, after everyone else had left California, was becoming something new. But it carried the weight of everything it had been. And if you stood still long enough under a sycamore tree at dusk, you could almost hear it breathe. A state learning how to remember. In Earthquake's Immigrants and the Promise That Shifted, by the time the calendar turned to 1890, the gold in California was mostly gone. Not entirely. Of course, there were still some mining camps clinging to hope in the Sierra foothills, but the frenzy had settled into something quieter. A memory, a legacy, a rumor of what once was. And California, ever restless, began to shift again, not just in spirit, but literally. The ground itself started to remind people that it was never fully tamed. In 1868, there had been a quake near Hayward that cracked walls and startled cows. People muttered about it and rebuilt, but it was nothing compared to what would come later. Still, even back then, the earth had moods. Folks said the ground in California was like a dreamer. It moved when no one was looking. Cracks in sidewalks, chimneys that tilted overnight, plates that slid off shelves with no explanation. But while the earth stirred beneath their feet, people were still arriving above it. This time, not for gold, but for a future. There were the Italians who brought grapes and vines and stories of hillsides back home. They planted vineyards in places called Napa and Sonoma, thinking the soil might remember something ancient. There were the Japanese who came with quiet discipline and deep pride. They farmed the land with care, growing rice and strawberries and persimmons. In time, their neighborhoods bloomed with lanterns and festivals, blending tradition with the ocean wind. There were the Armenians, the Portuguese, the Mexicans returning north, families escaping wars, famines, and the slow hunger of too little land back home. They settled in valleys and worked with their hands, building barns, churches, and dreams. And still California opened her arms, sometimes tightly, sometimes hesitantly, but always with that strange sparkle of maybe. You see, there was something addictive about California. It was not just the weather, though the skies were kind. It was not just the land, though the oranges were sweeter here. It was the idea, so fragile, so persistent, that maybe you could start over, if you came far enough, if you worked hard enough, if you believed long enough. But belief is not the same thing as acceptance. Some towns welcomed immigrants with parades. Others greeted them with silence or worse. There were signs in windows that said things no child should have to read. There were laws passed that made families feel like shadows. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became federal law. It was the first time the United States had singled out an entire group and said, "You are not welcome here." And it started in California. Some cheered it, others were ashamed. But life, as always, went on. The railroads kept humming, The orange groves stretched for miles. Children grew up speaking two languages, one for school, one for home. Mothers folded dumplings beside apple pies. Fathers prayed in temples and whispered stories about mountains, an ocean away. California was becoming complicated. Not the wild boom town of the gold rush, not the mission frontier, but something else entirely. A place stitched together from broken pieces and stubborn hope. And then, just before the century turned, came the whispers of something big. A city rising from fog and salt. San Francisco. It had always been there, of course, built on hills and boldness. But now, it was becoming a giant. The gold had passed through its ports. The railroad ended near its feet. Immigrants stepped onto its docks with shaking hands and wide eyes. It was a city of contradictions. There were ballrooms with gaslight chandeliers, and alleyways with barefoot boys selling fish. There were opera houses and opium dens, often just streets apart. There were mansions so grand they had names, and tenements so crowded no one remembered who lived where. But somehow it worked. At night, fog would drift in from the Pacific and cover the city like a lullaby. Streetcars clanged through the mist. Voices in 20 languages floated through the air. And the lights, those golden flickering lights, looked like promises kept. People said it was the Paris of the West. They were wrong, of course. Paris did not shake like this city did. It did not burn with the same nervous joy. It did not hum with the same restless electricity. No, San Francisco was not Paris. It was something new. And for those who had come west for gold, for work, for belonging, it was a place where they could finally stop moving. Or at least pretend to. Still underneath the glamour, the cracks remained. Earthquakes were not the only things shifting. Class lines hardened. Ethnic tensions simmered. Land grew more expensive. Dreams more narrow. And yet, the spirit lingered. It was there in the school teachers who taught kids to write both freedom and forgiveness. It was there in the corner markets run by families with last names no one could spell. It was there in the old miners who sat on porches and told stories that no one believed, but everyone loved to hear. California was growing up, not gracefully, not easily, but earnestly. And the world was beginning to notice. The quake that shook more than the ground. If you were living in San Francisco in the spring of 1906, you might have thought the world was finally settling into place. There were cable cars winding up steep streets, department stores with lace in the windows, and enough electricity humming in the wires to make people feel modern. But beneath all that progress, the earth still remembered. On April 18th, just as the sun was thinking of rising, the city shook. It did not rattle gently like it had in years past. This time the ground roared. It groaned like something ancient and furious had just woken up. People said the streets rolled like ocean waves. Brick walls folded, gas lines snapped, churches cracked open like eggs. And then the fires began. They said it was a broken chimney, or a gas lamp, or maybe just bad luck. But soon flames were dancing from rooftop to rooftop. Wooden buildings still dry from winter caught fire, like matchsticks. Firefighters tried to stop it, but the water mains had burst. They were left with buckets and courage. The fire lasted 4 days. By the end of it, more than 3/4 of the city was gone. Entire neighborhoods were ash. Grand hotels, marble columns. Opera houses reduced to smoke and rubble. Chinatown disappeared almost entirely. So did City Hall. And yet somehow the fog still came in every evening, like it always had, as if trying to comfort the ruins. But if you had walked through the city right after, you might have noticed something strange. People were not just mourning. They were moving. Men in suits handed out blueprints. Women in aprons swept rubble from stoops that no longer existed. Kids tied rags around their mouths and hauled bricks. The city did not sleep. It rebuilt. There was a stubbornness to it, a quiet vow that this place, this wild, shaky, hopeful place, would not vanish. And it did not. Within a year, San Francisco had electricity again. Banks reopened. Streetcars rang their bells. Theaters raised curtains. It was not the same, of course. How could it be? But it was alive. And alive was enough. Elsewhere in California, life marched on too. Los Angeles, which had always lived in San Francisco's shadow, began to stretch its limbs. There was oil beneath its feet and orange trees at its edges. Hollywood was just a sleepy suburb with cowpaths and eucalyptus trees. But not for long. In 1910, a group of men built a small studio in Los Angeles. They thought they could make pictures move. Moving pictures, they called them. Silent stories flickering across screens. At first, it was just cowboys and slapstick. Then romances. Then epics. And suddenly, California had another kind of gold. Not in the rivers, not in the hills, but in celluloid dreams. People came by the thousands again. Not with shovels, but with scripts. Not for mining towns, but for casting calls. They waited in line under the sun, wearing borrowed clothes, and hope. They came to be discovered. It was a new kind of rush, but the hunger was the same, and still the land kept shifting. In the fields of Central California, farm workers, many of them immigrants or children of immigrants, bent over rows of lettuce and grapes. They worked until their backs ached and their hands blistered. They sang in Spanish, Tagalog, Italian. And at night, they slept in tents or boxcars, dreaming of land they could one day call their own. Some got it. Most did not. But the dream, stubborn as ever, remained. California was becoming a paradox. It was wealth and poverty, glamour and grit, champagne and sweat. It was where millionaires built mansions by the sea, and migrant families slept under fig trees. It was where someone could sell a movie idea in the morning and wash dishes that night. And yet people kept arriving, because even after the fire, after the quake, after the myths faded, and the mountains were picked clean, California still whispered something irresistible. Maybe you would be the lucky one. Maybe the sun would shine just right on your little plot of land. Maybe your child would sing or dance or build something that mattered. Maybe your name, once strange and hard to pronounce, would one day be carved on a building. Maybe. And for millions, that was enough. A new dream. Under the same sun. Some nights when the wind was just right, people said you could still hear the echo of pickaxes in the hills. A soft rhythm under the hum of the telephone wires, under the engine of the Model T, beneath the jazz, floating from someone's porch. California had changed, yes, but some things stayed buried in its bones. By the 1920s, the state had settled into something almost steady. There were farms, now real ones, stretching farther than the eye could see. Rows of almond trees, vineyards that turned gold in the fall. Migrant workers moved with the seasons, picking, sorting, sweating under a sun that showed no mercy, but made everything grow. Some came from Mexico, crossing a border that felt more like a suggestion than a wall. Some came from Oklahoma and Texas, escaping the creeping failure of dry soil and broken banks. They called it the land of second chances. They did not know it would test them more than once. And then came the crash. A number on a board in New York turned the whole country sideways. Suddenly banks were gone. Jobs were gone. The laughter from those early jazz days went quiet. The newspapers still printed headlines, but nobody could afford to buy them. California did not collapse. Not exactly, but it shook. Farm prices fell. Cities swelled with people looking for anything, work, food, a place to stand still. And then, in the early 1930s, the sky turned cruel, back east. The Dust Bowl. You probably saw pictures of it. Black clouds of dirt rolling over barns, swallowing towns, blotting out the sun like the end of days. People wrapped rags around their faces. Babies coughed. Chickens lay down and never got up again. And so they left. Thousands of families packed what little they had into old trucks and drove west. They followed Highway 66, dragging their children and their broken luck behind them. Grapes of wrath, they called them. Okies. Dirt, poor, road-worn, desperate. They came to California with calloused hands and nothing else. But California was not ready. There were not enough jobs, not enough homes, not enough kindness. They lived in tents beside rivers, in tar paper shacks behind canneries. They stood in line for bread. They picked fruit for pennies under signs that said, "No Okies." And still they stayed. Because they had seen worse. Because even broken dreams look better in the sun. And then the wind shifted again. World War II. Suddenly factories buzzed with urgency. Planes needed building. Ships needed welding. The war effort was a machine, and California became one of its most vital gears. Women in overalls stood beside men on assembly lines. Rosies, they called them. Strong arms, tied back hair, a fire in their eyes. The ports of San Francisco, the shipyards of Richmond, the airfields near Los Angeles, they pulsed with life. And for a moment, the state felt united. Black workers, white workers, immigrants, and refugees, all standing shoulder to shoulder, holding rivet guns and watching the sky. But unity does not last forever. When the war ended, many hoped for peace. What they got instead was suspicion. In neighborhoods where Japanese families once lived, there were now empty houses. They had been taken. Not sold, not abandoned, taken. During the war, over 100,000 Japanese Americans, many born in this country, were forced into camps, behind barbed wire, in the name of safety. It was one of the darkest chapters in California's long story. Some never came back, but the state kept moving. In the 1950s, the freeways spread like veins. Suburbs popped up with matching houses and picket fences. Kids rode bikes on new sidewalks while their parents planted lawns in the desert. It was tidy, it was modern, it was strange, and just beneath that surface change was bubbling again. The 1960s brought protest. College campuses filled with chants and signs, civil rights marches, anti-war rallies, flower children drifting through Haight-Ashbury barefoot and dazed, believing love could fix everything. Not everyone agreed. Some saw it as chaos. Others saw it as finally waking up. And still, California shifted. In the Central Valley, Cesar Chavez began to organize farm workers. He had picked grapes. He knew the pain of bending over vines all day, with no water, no rights, no voice. He believed in dignity, in marching, in refusing to pick until the world noticed. Some did. And suddenly the story of California was not just one of dreams, but of struggle. Of people not just coming for gold, but fighting to stay. Of families trying to hold on to a patch of land, a school, a story. The sun still rose over the same mountains. The sea still whispered the same tide. But the people walking those beaches now carried histories that stretched far beyond the gold rush. California had become something bigger than a destination. It was becoming an idea. A messy, imperfect, sunburned, wondrous idea that maybe, just maybe, something better could be built here. Not just for you, but for whoever came next. The cracks beneath the gold. By the time the 1970s rolled in, California had taken on a shine of its own. Not the gold in the river kind, no. This was glossier, polished. It came from television screens and glossy magazines, from the Beach Boys' harmonies and the endless skies over Los Angeles. But like most things that shine too bright, if you looked close enough, you could see the cracks. Take Los Angeles, for example. It looked like a dream palm trees, movie stars, freeways that stretched to forever. But beneath the glamour was a city aching at its seams. Pollution hung in the sky like a second ceiling. The smog was so thick, some mornings children could not see the mountains at all. And those freeways, they carved up whole neighborhoods, especially Black and Latino ones. Places that had stood for generations were bulldozed to make room for someone else's version of progress. There were voices rising against it, Chicanos organizing in East LA, demanding education that reflected their lives, their history, African American leaders marching, speaking, building. But change came slow. It always did. Meanwhile, the dream machine kept humming. Silicon chips were being etched in dusty garages in Palo Alto. No one paid much attention at first, just some kids with big glasses and bigger ideas. But those chips would change everything. You remember the first computers, do you not? Big as a desk, loud as a fridge. And yet here in California, they were getting smaller, faster, smarter. The gold rush had never really ended. It had only changed form. In the 1980s, California became something of a paradox. On one hand, it was a land of tech boom and movie magic. On the other, it was a state grappling with rising homelessness, with the growing shadow of addiction. Cocaine flowed through clubs in Hollywood, while crack devastated neighborhoods just a few miles away. And in 1989, the ground reminded everyone that California was still built on fault lines, both literal and otherwise. The Loma Prieta earthquake struck in October. Bridges crumbled, freeways buckled like paper. The Bay Area shook and trembled as if the earth was trying to remember something it had forgotten. People ran barefoot in the streets holding children, calling names. Some said it was a warning, but California did not stop. In the 1990s, the internet began to crawl, then walk, then sprint. Dot-com companies filled glass buildings in San Jose and San Francisco. New millionaires were minted overnight, some barely out of college, some still living with roommates. Meanwhile, in South Central LA, the city burned. The Rodney King verdict had come in. Not guilty. 4 white officers, a black man beaten on camera. The city erupted in 6 days of fire-broken windows and deep wordless pain. It was not just about one man. It was everything that had come before him. Still, the headlines moved on. California kept building, and then came the 2000s. The dream sharpened again, this time in pixels. Reality TV made celebrities out of strangers. Tech giants grew so fast, they swallowed entire industries. There was money again, so much money. Yet rents soared. Homeless tents appeared under overpasses. The old cracks widened. Fires began to rage. Each summer, the flames got closer. Towns like Paradise disappeared in smoke. The wind carried ash hundreds of miles. People packed go bags in their garages, waiting for the text alert that would tell them to run. And the droughts, the endless droughts. You could see it in the reservoir's bathtub rings, marking where the water used to be. Farmers drilled deeper. Cities argued over who got what. Even the almond trees started to suffer. But California was never about giving up. Through it all, fires, quakes, protests, blackouts, people stayed. They built solar panels on their roofs. They marched for justice. They planted gardens on sidewalks. They made music in their garages and apps in their bedrooms. They kept dreaming, even when the dream cost too much. Because for all its faults, California had one thing no one could replicate: hope. Hope that tomorrow might be different. Hope that your kids might live better than you did. Hope that if you just got there, just crossed the desert, or the ocean, or your own doubts, something good would be waiting. Not gold, not fame, just a place to begin again. And so it was that the old gold rush never truly ended. It became a rhythm in the streets of Oakland, a hum in the vineyards of Napa, a whisper in the hills above Malibu. It pulsed in every story told around a campfire in Yosemite, every new idea scribbled on a napkin in a Silicon Valley diner. California had become a land where history and future danced a strange, slow waltz. One step forward, one step back, and always, always moving. Gold beneath the dust. And so here we are. From the first whispers of gold in a cold mountain stream to the gleam of silicon on a lab bench in Palo Alto. From wagon wheels creaking over muddy plains to satellites beaming data across oceans. California has always been chasing something just beyond the horizon. Not just gold, but the idea of gold. The idea that somewhere, somehow you could begin again. That if the land was wide enough, and the sky high enough, and the future unwritten enough, you might just find a better version of yourself at the end of the road. People came for many reasons. Some ran from war, some ran from poverty, some just ran. But they all believed. They believed in luck, in reinvention, in second chances. That maybe this time the story would end differently. And yes, they stumbled. Over rocks over each other. They made mistakes, some too big to name. They hurt people, they helped people. They built towns, and they buried them. They struck gold, and they struck out. But they kept walking. Because the dream was never just about what you could take. It was always also about what you could build. A home, a song, a memory, a life. Tonight, as you lie there, perhaps you can still hear it, that low hum of wagons rolling west, the distant echo of pickaxes against stone, the rustle of canvas tents flapping in the Sierra wind, the quiet hopes of people who had no map, but walked anyway. That sound never really left. It is buried now beneath the buzz of traffic, the click of keyboards, the whisper of wildfires in dry grass. But it is there. Still moving west, still dreaming, still hoping. Thanks for walking through this story with me. I hope it kept you company. Sleep well, friend, and may your dreams be full of open skies and golden light.